All right, diving into the Forgotten America podcast. Thank you for being here. I'm Steve Gruber.
And I'm Ivy.
Thank you so much for joining us here today. So many different threats to America. We talk about them here all the time, coming from different directions. But my next guest is a rarity. And when I say that, what I mean by that is investigative journalism in this world really doesn't exist much anymore.
No, not like it used to, that's for sure.
No, I mean, you've got when the sales department invaded the news department a few decades ago, it changed everything. Of course, I worked in local news back then. And when the sales department would come over, go ahead.
Yeah, you worked for NBC, and you always say that there was a book 5 inches thick of the things you shouldn't do or can't do.
Exactly.
And now you wonder, are there any rules at all when it comes to mainstream media, and are they actually digging for the truth?
I think the answer is no, too often.
Yeah.
And that's, she's right. That when I got hired at NBC, the do's and don'ts was a 3-ring binder about yay thick. 99% of it was don't do this. And I see things happen on network television and in broadcast and in newspapers that would have gotten me fired immediately, and justifiably so. But my next guest is an American investigative journalist. He's written a number of books, ones you've probably heard of: Clinton Cash, The Untold Story of How and Why Foreign Governments and Business Helped Make Bill and Hillary Clinton Rich, Secret Empires, How the American Political Class Hides Corruption and Enriches Family and Friends. The list goes on because he's been active for so many years. Brand new book out, The Invisible Coup, How American Elites and Foreign Powers Use Immigration as a Weapon. Boy, immigration has been front and center. Joining us is Peter Schweizer. Peter, thank you for being here.
Hey, great to be with you guys. Thanks for having me.
I think about threats to America. I think about China and Russia, movements inside this country that are communist and socialist. I've got to be honest with you, Peter. Other than the fact that you have illegal aliens coming across our border in mass during the Biden administration, closed down pretty well now, I never think of Mexico as being a threat. But in this new book, you explore that, don't you?
Yeah, look, the image that most people have of the Mexican government, and I'm not saying that it's entirely wrong, but the image we have is they're corrupt and they're basically hapless, right?
Right.
They couldn't threaten anybody. But the fact of the matter is they've figured out a way to weaponize immigration, and it's pretty ingenious in a way. It takes what is a major problem for them, seemingly, which is that millions of people from their own country want to leave and come to the United States, and turns it into a strategic benefit. And so what do I mean by that? Well, if you look at what Mexican leaders say about mass migration, they see it as an opportunity to exert sovereignty inside the United States just by the sheer number of people. I quote a number of officials saying this, more than a dozen. There was a government report issued in December of 2024 by the Sheinbaum government that said, and I quote, "There are 39.9 million Mexicans living in the United States. We are retaking territory that was stolen from us," end quote. That's a reference to, the 19th century U.S.-Mexican War. And you read that and you're kind of like, what are they talking about? And yet you realize they've created this infrastructure, a political infrastructure in the United States that is already exerting sovereignty in our country. So, for example, a lot of people don't realize this. I briefed the White House. I briefed top leaders in Capitol Hill. None of them knew about this. The fact that the Mexican government has senators and congressmen that serve in the Mexican parliament that live inside the United States. And their job is to represent Mexicans living in our country before the Mexican government. And that these same officials, along with the consulates, are also involved in organizing anti-ICE protests. And I have details on that in the book. And they're also involved in political action, in trying to defeat people who want a tight border. So what began as sort of some odd statements I ran across sort of morphed as the more I dug into it, is Mexico actually trying to take what would seemingly be a liability for them and actually turning it into a potent weapon. And it's working.
Yeah, it's remarkable to me when I hear him say that they have senators and members of their parliament not just appearing in the Mexican government, but living here. Mm-hmm. To me, that's shocking. So how is that even possible, that they have members of their their top government officials live in America. Now, just to be clear, historically speaking, I believe we purchased land from the Mexican government in 1846, and then the Gadsden purchased a bit smaller piece of land, which is now, I think, New Mexico. We paid for the land. How would it be stolen?
Yeah, well, maybe it's seller's regret. I don't know what we turned it into, but you're absolutely accurate and correct that the U.S.-Mexican War. If you look back at the history of the area, it was virtually unpopulated. That's why they were prepared to sell it. But to your point, how is this allowed to happen? Mexicans just did it. And they've done other things. In the early 2000s, illegals were having a hard time in the United States getting bank accounts, driver's licenses, because they didn't have any IDs. So the Mexican consulates in the United States just started issuing Mexican government IDs. And they went to places like San Francisco, where Willie Brown was the mayor, and other progressive cities. And they said, hey, we're offering these as IDs. These are like legitimate IDs. And that led the cities to tell the banks, you need to start accepting these as legitimate forms of ID. Congress never voted on that. The Bush administration, who was in office at the time, had no say in that. The Mexican government just started doing it. And that's really what we're seeing is this exertion of sovereignty, meaning, hey, you know what? We know there's a border there. Not only are we going to, encourage people to cross that border and go work in your country, we're going to actually start taking initiatives and enacting policies in your country that affect our people, and we don't really care what you say about it. So that's the reality of where we are today. And you look at what some of these elected officials say. There's a guy, Alejandro Robles, who serves in the Mexican Congress, apparently lives in Ontario, California. But in 2025, he was going across the United States, in his own words, quote, organizing the militancy, end quote, against the Trump administration. So he was meeting at places like People's Forum with Antifa type supporters. He was trying to get migrants politically active in the United States, legal and illegal. He wanted them out protesting on the streets. So these are hardcore activists. One of them, a senator, Senator Ruiz, she lives in Arizona, has introduced legislation to make Mexicans in California a state of Mexico. So this is all going on. We're not paying attention. We think of Mexico as kind of hapless, just kind of a neighbor that's kind of troubled. But I think the facts are far different.
And in terms of these actors in America, what is their end game? What are they trying to accomplish? I mean, they're here, they're almost acting as if they're like Mexican lobbyists. What do they want to achieve?
It's a great question, Ivy. It's hard to know. I don't think they talk about Reconquista, the retaking of territories they lost. I don't think they actually mean that California or New Mexico or Nevada are going to become states of Mexico. What I think they really mean is that they are going to exert some sovereign control and determine the political destiny of those regions of the United States by turning migrants in the United States into political lobbyists. And by the way, they already brag that they've done this. One of the things I talk about in the book is a meeting that took place at the Oklahoma City, Oklahoma consulate in the end of May of 2024. And this included, so these are diplomats, the Mexican government. They got consular officials from Los Angeles all the way to Orlando and consulates in between to go to Oklahoma City. They brought in senior officials from Mexico City. The foreign minister of Mexico addressed them by video. The other group of people that were there were Democratic Party political activists. And according to the transcript of the meeting, the conversation was about how they had turned California from red to blue. They had turned Arizona from red to blue, and that Republicans were going to learn that if you F around, you're going to find out. So it was a blatant, involvement in our presidential and congressional campaigns in 2024. So they're open about it. So I think that's what they want, and they feel like they are achieving that. They are sort of chipping away at our sovereignty and becoming power brokers. They talk about Mexicans in the United States as a strategic asset for Mexico that they can deploy. That if they need demonstrations, they can get them to go to the streets, whether it's on immigration or trade policy or whatever. So that is how they view it. And there's a whole series of things that they're doing to encourage that behavior. And I think it's working.
Yeah, I want to come back to some of that. But I want to focus on, first of all, they don't really think that they're going to turn Texas or Arizona or New Mexico back into Mexico proper, obviously. But if you turn a red state blue, then they can send their citizens over the border and get all of these benefits. They can drain the United States financially. They can take advantage of what we're doing to allow that border to be open like it was during the Biden years. But here's a phenomenon, Peter, that I want to ask you about, because in the 2024 election, Hispanic voters, those who've been here for more than a generation, are breaking hard to the Republican side. Now, look, I think this should be a nonpartisan issue. This is the United States. This is Mexico. Here's the line. I don't think there should be any partisan issue here, but of course, we see people on the left trying to take advantage of those coming into the country. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that if you look at the polling data and you look at the voting data, it's pretty clear. And I think this is why Democrats went from being restrictive on immigration because it affected, labor wages for the working class, to being open borders, is they saw the political benefit of it. So what we know is that roughly that first generation that votes, they break 85% for Democrats. That's what Democrats concluded.
Right.
But that changes over time. And so when you're talking about the second generation and third generation, it much closer among Hispanics gets closer to 50-50. The problem is that, a generation is 20 plus years. So you lock in a lot of Democratic Party voters. And again, this is the Democratic Party's analysis, not mine. You lock in a lot of voters. So there is a massive political component to this. And the Democrats have perpetuated this by, frankly, manipulating the citizenship process, right? If you want to become a naturalized citizen, my parents immigrated to the United States. They became naturalized citizens. You go through a process where you have to do an extensive criminal background check. There's a moral test, right? Have you been a drug dealer or something else, even though not convicted? There's a literacy requirement. Do you understand basic English? And a civics portion. Do you understand the basics of how U.S. government functions? Well, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and Joe Biden, all when they became president, completely gutted those requirements. Criminal background checks were ignored or tossed by the wayside. I mean, there are reports of people that were getting their citizenship while they were in jail. And the reason they did that is because they knew that by minting new citizens, you were in effect minting new Democrats. 85% of them were going to vote for the Democratic Party. So the biggest years in which they rammed through, by loosening these standards, new citizens were 1996, 2012, and 2024. Those are the three biggest years for naturalizations in modern American history. All three of those, of course, were re-election years for Democratic presidents. So this is what has happened to the process. Now, even if you are not voting, right? You're not a citizen, you're not illegally voting, and you're just a migrant here, there's still a huge political benefit for Democrats there as well, because our census, which determines how many congressional seats we get per state and what our electoral college vote will be that determines the president, that's not based on anything other than counting people. You're not counting citizens. The census counts just people. And so the state of California has, it's estimated, between 4 and 7 more congressional seats than it ordinarily would have, courtesy of illegals that are in that state. And even if you take that lower estimate of 4 congressional seats, keep in mind that means that illegals in California have greater congressional representation than 13 different U.S. states. So it's a massive political benefit. And that's why I think you're seeing so much resistance to any deportations, even the deportations of hardened criminals, because they know that this affects their political base.
It's unbelievable.
It really is. I mean, you sit here and, I wrote an article about this 15 years ago that we published where I said I thought back then, Peter, that there were 7 congressional seats in California. If you figure there's about 750,000 people per congressional seat, roughly, I thought the number was 7, and that was 15 years ago. It certainly hasn't gotten any better. The problem is we don't know how many people are here.
Right.
Right.
Well, and it gives more power to the illegal immigrants versus the American people.
Well, the more
and yeah, they have more representation in certain blue states than we do.
Well, just like he just said, more representation than Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Delaware, Rhode Island, Maine. They have more. I mean, you go all over the country. And it would just seem to me, Peter, that even Democrats would say that's a bad idea,
Well, not because of political power. They would prefer to have political power, I'm sure.
I think they've kind of made a deal with the devil, as it were. I mean,
Yeah.
they I think understand deep down that, this is probably not good for the country, but it's essential for their political success. They need this, and they say that. And the progressive wing within the Democratic Party, which is the dominant wing, obviously, they're even more direct in saying we need mass migration from the developing world. We need it from Latin America. We need it from Africa. Why? Because people that come from those countries tend to be overwhelmingly much more in favor of a strong central government. They want social welfare programs. They're more they sort of bow down to political power more than Americans are used to doing. They're less concerned with individual rights. There are obviously exceptions to this, but the polling's very clear. So progressives see this is a way that makes the country more left-wing, more progressive by importing these voters, and they can't win on these issues in the electoral ballot box. So
But if I may,
just import people. Yeah.
If I may, this is not new. In fact, what you're describing was enshrined in law in 1965 by Lyndon Baines Johnson with the Immigration Naturalization Act of that year, which shifted who came into this country. And it became exactly what you're describing, which is people that maybe don't care to assimilate. They're not coming from Europe anymore. It's not the same people coming from Ireland or Spain or Italy or whatever.
It's not merit-based as much as it is.
It's not merit-based, and it comes from countries like, Somalia, that's been in the headlines
third
a
world
lot.
countries.
Sure, right, and so this became the law in the aftermath of the assassination of President Kennedy, because Johnson ran through everything. He got Medicare, Medicaid, increased Social Security, and that immigration law of 1965 is the foundation where this all shifted, isn't it?
That was really the beginning of it. And you mentioned a word there, Steve, that I think is really important. That word assimilation, because that's the other thing that has happened. There used to be a consensus in the country that if you come to the United States, you want to embrace American values. You want to, embrace the American way of life. That has really shifted. A lot of the NGOs, I quote them in the book, Democrat Party leaders say, no, you shouldn't assimilate. That is bowing down to the superiority of Western civilization. We're not going to do that. And a lot of these foreign governments also aggressively in the communities denounce people that assimilate. I mentioned this guy, Alejandro Robles, earlier. So he's with the Morena Party, the ruling party. He's in addition to being in the Mexican Congress, he was a senior party official for the Morena Party, knows the current president, Sheinbaum, well. And he said in 2025 that immigrants from Mexico that come to the United States and Americanize or become American are traitors. They're traitors to Mexico and need to be denounced. And he says Sheinbaum agrees with him. So there's a lot of social pressure that is applied. If you come to the United States and you want to embrace the American dream, you are going to get resistance in your own community from the home country saying, why are you doing that? Don't be a traitor. So it's a very, very different approach. And I think it's one of the goals here is kind of the balkanization of the United States. It's to turn migrants into levers of power and influence for the home country, and it's a way to fragment the
know,
United States.
Here's where I get confused. They flee Mexico because it's corrupt. And because it's, look, I've been in the tourist areas of Mexico. I've also been to the Yucatan Peninsula, where there is abject poverty in some of these places, doing filming and so forth. You know, once you get out of the Americanized areas for tourists and so forth, it's a very different country. It's poor, dirt poor. Some of the worst poverty in the world could be found in pockets of Mexico. So they flee that. Right? But then you see the demonstrations on television with all the Mexican flags flying, not American flags, Mexican flags flying. So they flee the country because it's corrupt, it's dirty, they're not making a living. And we've got a woman that we spoke to here who has been living in the United States for 25 years. She's here legally. Grew up in a little farming village near Cozumel. It doesn't matter. Anyhow, little farming village. I said, can you go back? She goes, no. The cartels have taken over that area, but what she said was they pay duty to farm their chickens, to farm their goats, to do their things there. And so they flee that for a better world. And it's true of all these third world nations. Then they want to turn America into what they left. How does that ever make any sense?
Well, yeah, it's the information, what they've been told is the reason that the home country, Mexico's in terrible shape is it's America's fault, right? It's American capitalism.
Isn't it always?
This is what Scheinbaum's position is, that America's to blame, and she's really embraced the indigenous values, as she calls it, of Mexico. So she's even denounced Spain. And the Spanish influence, and AMLO, the predecessor, Lopez Obrador, her mentor and the predecessor of Mexican president, said all of Mexico's problems started when the Spanish arrived, because before the Spanish, this is of course under the Aztecs.
Yeah,
there was no war. There was or the Mayans, but there was no war. There was no slavery. There was no greed. There was no oppression until the Spaniards arrived. And so this is what they've been taught. So they some come here and immediately the light bulb goes off and they say, wait a minute, things are different here. I've been lied to. But when you're in communities where there is this pressure to not assimilate, and the Mexican government itself is trying to influence migrants here. They set up something 2 years ago called Migrante TV, Migrant TV. This is funded by the Mexican government and controlled by, and they beam out this streaming news service that's targeted at Mexicans in the United States. It is some of the worst anti-American propaganda you are ever going to see. And that's what they want migrants in the United States to be thinking about the country that they are in.
Wow. Peter, what role do the drug cartels play in all this?
They play a big role in all this, Ivy. That's a great question. The cartels are deeply embedded in the political leadership class in Mexico. As I point out in the book, the current president, Scheinbaum, certainly has direct ties to the drug cartels. She has appointed senior people to the national police that are known to be associates of the drug cartels, even though these are the guys that are supposed to be controlling law enforcement. But the drug cartels have also migrated north of the border in terms of political influence. So there's been a move among progressives in the United States by Bernie Sanders and others to form an international body where progressives in North America and South America will work together. It's called Progressive International. It was founded by Senator Sanders in 2018. It's run by his former foreign policy advisor. His staff does a lot of work with them. AOC, a bunch of congressmen are involved as well. The problem is Progressive International, when you look at the leadership that is involved there, and I go into excruciating detail about this in the book, probably 30% of their leaders are directly tied to the drug cartels. Just no question about it. And what's happened is American progressives, I argue in the book, have embraced the agenda of the drug cartels. So what does Progressive International push for? They push for open borders, which of course was not Bernie Sanders' position 15 years ago, 10 years ago. They push for open borders. The drug cartels want open borders because during the Biden administration, they made more money smuggling people across the border than they did selling drugs. So
Wow.
human smuggling is a big profit center for the drug cartels. The second thing they pushed for that the drug cartels want is the end of military operations against the drug cartels in Latin America. And in fact, some of these people like AOC have introduced legislation to try to get the US government to stop running military operations against the drug cartels, which again, it's obviously why the cartels would want that. So the cartels play an important role in here. They are very, very tight with progressives in Latin America, and they have used that as a way to push their influence north of the border, and they're affecting the debate in this country. And we should be very, very worried that we cannot have, I think, a good, healthy conversation about anti-drug military operations without this influence trying to interrupt it. The good news, of course, is that based on what's happened in Venezuela and elsewhere, this has not affected Trump administration policy, at least thus far.
You know, when I look at this, and you look at what's happening in the Western Hemisphere, Maduro obviously important, but you look at the elections recently in Central and South America, be it Costa Rica, Honduras, Chile, Argentina, there is a wholesale rejection of socialism. There's a wholesale rejection of communism. Cuba is teetering. They could end up, wouldn't it be amazing if Cuba was a free country? But there is this rejection by the people who have been subjected to these socialist, corrupt socialist governments. El Salvador should obviously be mentioned. Bukele has taken the most dangerous country on the planet, and now their murder rate is less than Canada. I mean, these are remarkable changes that should be noted and taken seriously. I do want to back up, though, to something you said about Scheinbaum now demonizing the Spaniards. This isn't new. Howard Zinn and other discredited writers, he's not a historian, writers who made up fiction and sold it to American school kids. Apparently that goes on in Mexico too. Not to take away from your book, but I've been reading a book called Not Stolen that goes through the numerical facts of Central and South. It's a great book because he points out quite clearly, if there was this wholesale slaughter of the people that were here, the Mayans, the Aztecs, whomever, the Taino Indians, then why is it that all of these countries in Central and South America only have 10% European populations? And in fact, Taino Indian blood, native blood, is in better than 60% of the population. If they were actually exterminated the way it's been sold to American school kids and Mexican school kids, that wouldn't be true. The fact of the matter is they create this fallacy and they want to make America the devil, when in fact America is the one that has created the opportunity for them to come here. Now, if they come here legally, I think that's great. I have no problem with that, right? So we have to correct the record, but man, you're up against it because Howard Zinn poisoned the minds of more than one generation with his garbage about the history of the American experiment, right?
Yeah, no, it's when you start to look at the basic historical facts, the case falls apart. The problem is the basic historical facts are not being taught anymore. So if you look at the history of when the Spaniards arrived in Mexico, how did they defeat the Mayans or the Aztecs? How did they undermine these massive powers? They had the help of other local native tribes. There were not that many conquistadors that defeated them. There were estimated to be 500, but they defeated them with the help of smaller tribes who were tired of being brutalized and oppressed by the Mayans and the Aztecs. And these were societies that had human sacrifice, that had horrible human rights violations. So it's utterly bizarre to me that Scheinbaum and AMLO have embraced that part of Mexico's history. Look, every civilization you go back to has its warts and has its terrible features, but the notion that it's the West that uniquely caused these problems is just laughable. But it goes to the heart of, I think, what's going on with mass migration, which is it's not just about economics. It's not just about culture. This is kind of a civilizational war that is occurring. I mean, the Chinese certainly call it a civilizational war overtly. But even for Mexico, there is this civilizational war that is taking place because they have a radically different view of the way society should be organized, what we should value, how rights should be determined and where they come from. And that's really at the heart of what we're debating here.
It is remarkable that we do that. I mean, Ivey's entire family is Spanish speaking, right? And so I am immersed in that.
Yeah.
But they're all Americans.
Yes.
And proud to be Americans.
Absolutely. And you were talking, Steve, about correcting the record. And you have mainstream media, you have social media, you have the foreign actors. You have all of this working against the truth. And you also mentioned talking about shifting the narrative, because how much outrage was there when we were blowing up all of these cartel boats?
Yeah, the drug boats.
Oh my goodness, these poor folks. And we're not talking about, hey, all the lives that we're saving because of us doing this.
Yeah.
I think it's an uphill battle when you talk about changing the narrative and correcting the record. I wonder, what kind of steps can we take to really do that?
I guess my question, based on what Ivey's saying there, is the cartels, they make billions of dollars, whether it's human trafficking, illegal drugs, whatever else they're into, making the people pay as if, just like the mafia would in the days of old. You got to pay the freight for your protection. Is that culture coming into America, and are the cartels too big to control it? We know that Donald Trump designated them terrorist organizations, designated terrorist organizations, 6 of them in Mexico. But Peter, are they too big and too powerful and too rich? I mean, look, they're all on the take. I've been to Mexico. I've been pulled over by the federales when we were there bird hunting. And they go through all your stuff, and they want to see all your permits. And all of our permits are perfect, of course, because we went through customs coming through. Oh, no, it's wrong. All of a sudden, a little paper changes hands. Oh, everything looks great. See you guys later. Have a nice hunt. And that's the way it worked. Now, I don't go to Mexico anymore. That's been 15 years because I don't think it's particularly safe anymore. But are the cartels too big, too rich, too powerful? Because I think they're the ones running Mexico more than the politicians. Can they be controlled?
That's a good question. And I would say, I mean, as you were talking about your experiences in Mexico, I mean, one of the things that I find so curious about this is really how insulting it is. The position of the left basically is, well, this is just the way that they do it in Mexico or in Latin America. This is just sort of part of the culture, which to me is incredibly insulting. You're basically saying that, no, that people don't mind operating that way. I think ordinary people in Mexico are sick of the cartels controlling things. They're sick of this corrupt political class, but it's hard to defeat it. And that's really what it comes down to. I think what Trump is trying to do, and it'll be curious to see whether he can accomplish this, he is trying to pressure President Sheinbaum so aggressively to allow U.S. military strikes against the cartels in Mexico, to do maybe not a snatch and grab like we did in Venezuela, but to engage in military operations in Mexico. And she is absolutely resisting. She's claiming it's because of national sovereignty, although they're messing with our sovereignty every single day with what they're doing here. But I think he's trying to pressure and force her into that action, because I do think if you can create a split between the political class in Mexico and the cartels, we can take them out. We may not completely eliminate them, but we can do massive damage to them. But it's really going to come down to, does Sheinbaum have the courage and the ability to stand up to the cartels and say, okay, we're going to let you do this? I'm rather doubtful. Doubtful. I think she fears not just for her financial and political fortunes, but I also think for her life and the life of her family, that if she authorized this, she would become a target herself. But we'll see. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, it wouldn't take much. 3 or 4 Predator drones would send a hell of a message if they went into cartel operations directly. Now, I want to go back to something you said, Ivey, and that's the human cost. I mean, we see it here. We've had people on our programs and so forth, mothers and brothers and sisters and so forth, that have lost loved ones to fentanyl overdoses. We had a friend of ours just last year, his son, 19-year-old college kid, went out on the weekend, smoked a joint. No big deal. We've all been in college, right? It was laced with fentanyl. The kid died. All right, so these are the stories that you don't hear. The left is worried about these drug boats and not worried about the families that are left in wreckage in America because people die. But I want to go back to the human cost of this human trafficking. I mean, this is something that I think hits home with you.
Yeah, I've been talking about this for years, that, you know, children are more, you know, more valuable than drugs and weapons and all of these things. And it's a really difficult thing, I think, for people to really realize and talk about, but it is an important thing to talk about.
Well,
because
when he says they make more money off from running kids.
Yeah, well, human trafficking.
Well, at every level, but you know.
Yeah, and then there are a lot of children in there
right.
as well. But.
So, I mean, how many people, I guess I just frame it this way, Peter. How many people have to pay with their lives? And wouldn't the Mexican people or the people from Central American countries, those 7 countries, or the South American countries, why wouldn't they be outraged that their children are being snatched, that their wives are being snatched, that their sons are being snatched and sent across our border for some sort of, I'll just call it, you know, sadistic, evil appetite for these people? Why are these countries not saying, look, stop it? But instead what we saw is people flooding through the Darien Gap, Mexico putting them on trains, the beast, and bringing them north. Why, I mean, Bukele and some of the others are saying no more. But why aren't the people outraged? I mean, it's their family members that are disappearing to God only knows where, right?
Yeah, I think fear plays a huge role in this, and also, you know, in some cases, their situations in their home countries are so destitute they're looking for any opportunity to flee. The problem is you have no accountability. You have a political leadership class that in a lot of these countries, not all, is wholly and totally corrupt and completely unaccountable to anyone. I mean, one of the things I write about in the book that gets overlooked is, you know, Mexico certainly did things right after Joe Biden was declared the winner in November 2020. Mexico convened a meeting of their parliament and passed 3 bills that they knew were going to open up the floodgates and send people north to the border into the United States. In Nicaragua, which is run by Daniel Ortega, the Marxist dictator, he shortly after that said, hey, guess what? Anywhere in the world, charter a plane, fly to Nicaragua, pay us a small fee. We will get you to our northern border, and then you can get into the United States via Mexico. And it's estimated that more than 2.5 million people did so. They chartered planes from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, from the Caribbean, and they flooded into Nicaragua. So there's no accountability for that. And you still have progressives on the left that think Daniel Ortega is some great, you know, revolutionary reformer. So it's a huge problem. And, you know, it's very hard for somebody on the outside like us to try to fix this because you don't have the indigenous forces in those countries that are willing to make the reform. And Mexico, I think, is certainly an example of that. I would hope that we could get leadership in Mexico that would address these issues in a real way. But every time somebody seems to come along as a reformer, you know, they end up either, you know, punting on those reforms or, you know, being paid off or whatever. So it's a very discouraging thing. But the bottom line is we've got to maintain a sealed border in the United States. It's not our responsibility to fix the world. We can help those that are trying to fix their own countries. But we've also got to dismember these political networks that they have set up inside the United States that are undermining our sovereignty. That's just not what we should be allowing any foreign powers to do. And that's what we've been allowing to happen.
And that takes me right to my next question, which is what actions do we need to take to reverse this attack on our sovereignty? I mean, what's the solution?
Well, I think it begins with recognition, right? That's hopefully what I've done with this book. Before the book came out, I had an opportunity to meet with the president in the Oval Office for about 55 minutes. He also had the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, in the room. And I briefed them on these policies and issues. And I did the same thing on Capitol Hill with probably half a dozen senators and members of Congress. So part of it begins with awareness, understanding what's going on. And it's easy to think that our leaders pretty much know everything that's going on. The problem is they are bombarded with so much stuff. It's really hard for them to separate the wheat from the chaff. Mm-hmm. So it begins with awareness. You know, the book, I think, is bringing awareness to the public of what's really going on. And the response has been Amazing. We've been out for 3 weeks and we've been #1 on the New York Times bestseller list every single week. So it begins with awareness, but then it begins with specific solutions. And those solutions include things like shutting down the vast majority of these Mexican consulates, not allowing them to run this governmental system of representation in our country. It also begins with telling foreign agitators that are in the country, if you're here and you're trying to agitate for American politics, we're going to pull your visa and we're going to send you back home, because this is not a role that you should be playing. And there's a series of other policies that I call for in the book. So there are things that can be done, but the first thing we have to do is understand fully what's going on, and then we can act.
Great question. Great answer. Anything else? It's a great book. I've been able to read some excerpts from Peter. Again, I was serious off the top when I said, very few investigative reporters exist in the wild anymore. They've all got an agenda. They've all got something going on. But I look at people like you or John Solomon. There's a few still left in the wild out there doing real work. And I think that what you're doing is so incredibly important, because look, this conversation we've just had here, people don't know these things. People don't know there's upwards of 60 Mexican consulates in America working to give out identification and make it easy for people to be here.
I mean, I certainly didn't know, and I'm in news, so.
Yeah.
And same for you.
I didn't know it either until I heard you on another conversation here a few days ago. So, the book, The Invisible Coup, How American Elites and Foreign Powers Use Immigration as a Weapon. I'll give you the last word, Peter. Just encapsulate where we are. And if we don't do anything different, it's going to be a problem. Last word to you.
Well, I would just say our federal government did a study in the late 2000s to look at what were the 3 most successful attacks against the United States. Number 1 was 9/11. Number 2 was Pearl Harbor. Number 3 was the Mariel boat lift. And that's when in 1980, Fidel Castro took a refugee crisis and embedded within the refugees psychopaths, drug dealers, intelligence officers, and it wreaked havoc in the United States. That was regarded as the 3rd most successful attack on the United States. If you look at all 3 of those, what happened after 9/11? We took out Al-Qaeda. What happened after Pearl Harbor? We destroyed the Japanese Empire. What happened after the Mariel boat lift? Nothing.
Nothing.
The brilliance of migration as a weapon is there's nobody to bomb. There's no military targets to strike. That's what makes this so insidious. So we've got to deal with weaponized immigration, which is what's taking place right now. This has been a replay of the Mariel boat lift on a grand scale. We have to deal with that first, and then we can get to the larger issue of legal immigration and what that level should be. I actually think immigration is an important part of the American story, but you can't address that issue until you control this other part of it. And that's, I think, the ultimate lesson that I try to draw in the book.
Well, not only did we do nothing to expand just on your third point there of the Mariel boat lift, we turned the people that came here into the victims. They've been turned into the victim. They're the sympathetic figure now in the conversation from those on the mainstream media and everywhere else. How can you attack this poor family? They're just trying to make a living and so on and so forth. So even more complicated. Peter Schweizer, it's been a real honor.
Well, thank you, Steve Ivey. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Appreciate all the important work you guys are doing.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Peter.
So we sit here and, we talk about the Chinese. Mm-hmm. We talk about the Russians, the Iranians, all the different things and the challenges we face. We talk about the democratic socialists and the agitators and so forth. Mm-hmm. I never thought of Mexico as being a threat to the United States. Did you?
I thought about the threat of Mexico in a different way, through the drug cartels and the human trafficking and the flood of illegal immigrants. I did see it as an issue through that lens. But not as strategic as they actually are utilizing taking over our sovereignty. You never considered that.
You saw it as a loose, this is happening, they're fleeing their country.
Right.
You
thought of it more as this is actually, the people are doing this. And
right.
Of course they would want to leave Mexico and come to America. Everyone wants to come to America.
Right. What you didn't see was the organized strategy, right? That's what you're saying.
No, I was not aware of that. And we had this conversation a couple days ago. that there's just so many players that are attacking the United States constantly and using similar methods. And it's like, when you really sit down and think about it, it's a kind of like, how do we overcome all of this? There's so many attacks in America, even from within and outside, foreign.
You know, the one thing I didn't ask him that I wanted to ask him, I should have, the role of social media in all of this.
Yeah, I certainly, I think I mentioned it there just briefly, but you know, when you look at social media and the things that are being presented to you are only saying, oh, the poor immigrants, they're taking them off the street and they're disappearing people, and then this becomes the narrative.
Right.
And then that's how they get control, because then that changes people's minds, and then they go to the voting booth and they may vote for a Democrat even though they voted Republican before, because, well, the Republicans are bad because look at what they're doing.
They're mean, right? And that's what I said. The difference about the Mariel boat lift from Cuba was there was nobody to attack, like Peter said.
Yeah.
And then you turn the people that came here into the victims, which is what you just said. The
Which is,
mainstream
and
media.
they're doing the same thing with the illegal immigrants now.
Right.
With all of these criminals. I mean, I read a list of the top 10 worst
Oh, and their crimes are.
crimes, sodomizing children, raping children, murdering children. We don't want these people in our streets, but you don't hear about that. You hear about the poor souls that immigrated here just to have a better life, to reach, to have the American dream.
And there is some of that.
And there is some of that, but that is not the narrative. The narrative,
They're all victims.
They're all victims. And yes, they're coming here to try to get the American dream, but what the reality is ICE is utilizing their powers to get the criminals off the streets, not just some random folks.
Right. But here we are, the cartels, other foreign entities. I believe the Chinese pay for some of this. I believe the Russians pay for some of this to create this chaos.
What was the one guy, Abrego Garcia?
Yeah.
Here's a criminal, lifelong criminal.
Who was
people are outraged the fact that he had to leave America.
Yeah. By the way, he's still here. Even though he was caught with a load of illegals, I think in Tennessee, coming across the country delivering more illegals. A lot of work to be done.
Yes, there is.
A lot of work to be done. This is why we have these conversations. It's not forgotten here.
No.
We dig deeper. We find more. Peter Schweizer, again, go find the book, The Invisible Coup, How American Elites and Foreign Powers, and people like George Soros use immigration as a weapon. And it is a weapon politically, financially, and as we just discussed, emotionally.
Yes.
It is. Thank you for being here. Be sure to become a subscriber right here. Click the like button down here. This is Forgotten America on YouTube. We'll see you here shortly.